donning green shirt, but I didn't don my green trousers for today, so I thought I would try to fit in. Okay, so this is really kind of about the sort of other side of the coin, really. It's about sort of establishment politicians and looking at people sort of who embraced anti-Semitism, particularly within their political discourse after 1931, and really, to sort of look at whether or not, are these people, if you like, getting in touch with their anti-Semitic side? Are they people who've always been anti-Semitic and they're suddenly taking advantage of it to come through? Or are these people, as some people just say, really just opportunists? Look, there's a discourse, it's going to get me votes, so I'm just going to jump on the bandwagon and I'm just going to ride with it. But what I want to do is to look a bit more sort of in depth and actually sort of say, well, to what extent is it that Romanian party politics and the nature of the Romanian party system actually facilitated this? And I'm going to look at a case of a sort of second-tier politician, a guy called Mihai Șerban, and look at his kind of career and trajectory, because over his political career, he switches parties 4 times. He goes from between various different parties, and he ends up a minister in Carol II's National Renaissance Front. So, as we said, we've got kind of these kind of images here. So this kind of, as I said, this kind of the Alfie question, what's it all about? Why should we care? And Raoul's obviously talked about anti-establishment anti-Semitism. Well, this is kind of establishment, mainstream sort of anti-Semitism. Okay. So this is the Șerban archive, and this is kind of what I've been sort of working on, and this is it in all of its glory. And the thing that's nice about the Șerban archive is that basically he was a magpie. He kept everything. So you have a real sense of what's on his mind. You have a real sense of whatever his little concerns are for everything. So everything from love letters to an announcement that he's been invited on the first rapid train from Cluj to Bucharest, to arguments with printers about things and so on and so forth. He's kept it, so everything is there, and so you can really sort of see what's on his mind. And you can really start to see, well, when's he talking about stuff that's anti-Semitic and so on and so forth. So I just want to sort of start with just a brief look at sort of Penetze, which is where he spent most of the time, which is the peasant party, sort of the major party. And it was basically widely expected after 1918, with the advent of universal suffrage, that because this party claimed to represent the peasantry the largest social class, therefore, as their natural representatives, they would the Assembly would say would naturally dominate post-war politics. This obviously didn't happen. What it is that the party is very, very heterogeneous, it's very oppositional in its discourse, and essentially it comes to be dominated by middle-class members of the Transylvanian elite, and there are actually, despite being a peasant party, there are no peasants representing it in Parliament. You go through the parliamentary representatives and it lists their various jobs, and there's no peasants there. Where are the peasants in the peasant party? And this has kind of been my big quest. Where is the voice of these Bessarabian peasant women? Where's the voice of the peasant? What do peasants think about what's going on? So we've talked about how there are kind of there are 5 different types of Judaism and so on and so forth and everything else. Well, within the peasant party, there are at least 4 different types of peasantism. We can't even talk about one peasant party. So essentially, and what it is that they all disagree about what's the relationship between the peasant and the point of the party. So you've got basically, you start off with your nationalists who say anything that is good for the nation is good for the peasant. Right? Then you have those who effectively invert this, say anything that is good for the peasant is good for the nation. So if you strengthen your peasant, then you've got, Then you have those who are generally on the left who view the peasantry as a social class and really favour sort of economic solutions and things like this, and really emphasise capturing the state. And then you have the final group who are kind of technocratic, who basically just view it as kind of a technical issue. And you fix the technical issues and everything. And there's all these different debates that go on within it. Okay. Now, the key point, and this is where we're going to go into the pol sci, is you've got somebody like Angelo Canebianco who kind of really argues that what you have to look at with any organisation is the modes of institutionalisation, and the way in which institutions are formed, the way in which power is distributed, and so on and so forth. Once you've got a handle on that, you can actually then start to see the way in which institutions behave afterwards. So why are institutions volatile? Why are institutions behave in certain ways? Henry Bianco's other key point, and this is the key point which I think we often don't think about when it comes to thinking about peasant party and about political parties. Henry Bianco's point is political parties are organisations, just like every other organisation, and actors behave in it as they do in organisations. They have their own power interests, which are often nothing to do with the goals of the party. So, as we all know from having worked in universities and dealt with administrators and things like this, who seem determined to trip us up all along the way and never really embrace all of our good ideas and things like this, like giving us jobs, okay? The things that are good for the organisation, okay? Because basically it threatens their particular interest. So, a very good example that Henry Bianco gives is, why would a party leader not want to expand the number of members of the party? Well, he might argue, Henry Bianco's argument is very simple. If there are more party members, there are more potential threats to their leadership. There are more people who might dilute their power base, and so party leaders may actively, in trying to control their own power within the party, actually act against the wider interest of the party. So this is kind of what we have to see. So what he says is that basically all parties have two types of people, believers and careerists, okay? And basically the majority of successful politicians are careerists. So what he says here, you've got believers. So believers, they're devoted to the official goals of the party. They're the ones who vehemently protest when the party deviates from its goals and things like that. So if we're talking about a peasant party, these are your class people. These are the people who really believe in peasantry as a class, things like this. Then you have the careerists. And the careerists are not so concerned with the kind of ideological thing, but they're the ones who are most interested in getting power. And they're the ones who are most interested in office and things like this. And these are the people who will go and, create turbulence and create threats and defect and all these other things, and they're the ones who have to kind of be trans-neutralized. But as well as kind of being the most threats, they're also the ones from whom the leadership kind of comes from, because you actually need these people to actually kind of really generate a party, or sort of generate a powerful party. So beyond that, we then have this question about party organisation. And here we go to kind of Maurice de Berger, and basically talk about, there's two types of party effectively at this period of time. You've got cadre parties and you've got mass parties. And that each of these has specific forms of organisation and internal power structures, and that each of these organisation structures reflects when the parties were formed. And that basically cadre parties represent this kind of pre-mass suffrage organisation, whereas mass parties represent kind of post-suffrage. So with a mass party, you're really trying to get lots of members, lots of people involved and things like that. With a cadre party, you're not so concerned about that. So what do we find with Pennant say as a party organisation? Essentially, it's a cadre organisation at the elite level, but with mass elements bolted onto it in the village. So they kind of have the attempt to try and get lots of peasants involved, and they're very concerned with the number of peasants involved and things like this. This is one kind of such meeting. The cadre elements are strongest in Transylvania, which is where the dominant wing of the party comes from, and this is also the element which is the most long established, so the most institutionalised element. So going back to Henry Bianco's stuff about sort of institutionalisation. Now, what's interesting is that in Bessarabia, where there's been no previous organisation, what we find is actually the strongest elements of mass organisation and the greatest amount of sort of young peasant agency. So basically, the key thing with the cadre organisation is that it's got very small groups of members. Basically, you are in there because it's about notables, it's about influential people, it's about having a name, prestige, networks, all of these sorts of things. It's about expertise, things like this. Quality, not numbers, is the most important thing. So this is kind of why you see people who are very, very connected into networks. So what he says here is that basically you don't join it as a closed group, okay? Membership is achieved through co-option, they have a lot of strength through their skills and so on and so forth, okay? They're not really interested in numbers and things like this. But the point is that in a cadre organisation, adherence to the organisation is a completely personal act. Your loyalty to the organisation is your personal loyalty. Your loyalty to either somebody that you are connected into or things like this. You don't adhere on ideological grounds. Okay. So again, to just sort of say, so what we tend to find is that essentially, this, PNSA, particularly in Transylvania, is a classic cadre organisation. So as I said, what we find is extensive use of familial intersectional networks, personal relations are what matter, these organisation structures are entrenched. Any attempts at reform, so any attempts to show a shift from a cadre organisation to a mass organisation would have naturally eroded the power basis. So the reason why people are powerful in Transylvania or in particular factions is because they have very strong familial networks. Well, if you suddenly say, well, actually, your networks don't really count, but we're more interested in making sure we have 500 peasants, that obviously challenges. So you're going to therefore kind of resist. Now, the other thing is that what we actually notice is that elsewhere, particularly in Sweden, for example, the party doesn't, this cadre structure isn't institutionalised, so they're actually able to sweep it away and go for mass organisation. That's another story for another day. But the main point is that it's a very, very static organisation. And the only way in which you can get promoted in the organisation is through death, somebody else defecting, or defecting yourself. Otherwise, you're stuck. You're stuck in a holding pattern. So, essentially, what we see is that what this means is that we have the appearance of a very, very volatile party system. We have a party system where we seem to see people just defecting, joining parties, parties appearing, parties disappearing, and things like that. But we actually see remarkable consistency in the number of actors. Okay? We often find that actors are locked into sort of social networks, and that when people are defecting, they're not defecting on ideological grounds. They're defecting because the person that is a cousin or is married to somebody's sister and things like this. So you find that you've got that, but at the same time, defection also represents an opportunity for personal advancement. It represents an opportunity for you to get promoted. Okay, so that's obviously PNSA in all its organisational glory, sitting around, probably discussing stuff and not really doing very much because that's usually important. So here's Shaban. Okay, so he's by the Voivode's godson. He's interesting because in 1907 he's mobilised as part of the Austro-Hungarian army, and he's mobilised into Transylvanian villages when they're concerned about the peasant uprising spreading from the Regat into Transylvania. He becomes very interested in peasant issues, basically based on what he sees in villages and things like this. He is educated in Austria and Germany, and after 1918 he becomes rector of the agricultural section of the University of Cluj. He's an internationally recognised expert on Romanian agriculture. He's one of the main sources that David Mitrani uses in his book on Land of the Peasant and things like this. He's a guy who is very, who is a very well-known figure amongst the agricultural studies. Basically, his problem is, and he's a very key member in Cluj because he's an excellent administrator. He's dealing with this very amorphous, very fluid, very weakly held organisation, and he's basically one of the few people who kind of holds it together. So this is the sort of thing he's dealing with, and this is the sort of material we've got. This is a note scrawl which says basically the whole Fagarash party has defected to join Aberescu. I've no idea what's going on. We don't know. I'm going to go and see what happens. He's dealing with this, and he's like, well, okay, fine. Well, we have to. What's going to happen in Fagarash? And he's the point man for dealing with this sort of stuff between the villages and the kind of village level. During the PNSA government, he becomes deputy agriculture minister. He is he's in the Senate, but basically he gets squeezed. Intellectually, he is interested in peasant and agricultural issues. This is the main thing that is reoccurring time and time again. There's no real evidence of any nationalism or anti-Semitism or things like this. What he's interested in is peasant issues and running the party. But the point is that he's really hit a brick wall in his career by the early 1930s. He can't get promoted. He's squeezed on the list, and so he keeps on losing his seat in the Senate. He's waiting around for people to die. Is his only hope within the party. And then, basically, we had the 1935 split between the parties. This is obviously when the Peasant Party actually shifts leftwards and becomes actually quite kind of radical, which also dates from the poster that we saw at the beginning and the poster which we saw in this. So this is the kind of split. So again, you can kind of see the sort of stuff that's sort of going on. You can see the kind of imagery that Vida sort of adopts and things like this, legionary and Christian cross and all these other things. But you know, what's kind of interesting is again this kind of very fluid. So basically, in 35, the party shifts leftward. It starts to shift its organisation. This really challenges the cadre elite. This really challenges people like Vida in terms of their power base and things like this. And we see that a large number of prominent Transylvanians, many of these related, leave the party in 1935. And this is actually basically Chauvin's notes in the margin, where he's trying to work out who's left the party. He's, there's a real sense of confusion and things like this. So off he goes with his godfather, and this is Frontal Romanesque membership card, and you can see again the close relationship between Chauvin and Vida as his godfather. You can obviously see numerous placas and so on and so forth. Okay. And this is the early stuff that is coming out of Frontal Romanesque. You can see, there's kind of nationalism in there, but it's not. There's nothing which really kind of screams sort of anti-Semitism or things like this. But the point is, this is very, very populist. Lots of stuff about agriculture and so on and so forth. But for Chauvin, it's promotion. He goes from being kind of stuck, dealing with nonsense in Cluj, to heading up the Mureș party branch. He's headed to Mureș County. He starts to really. The agricultural stuff kind of wanes in terms of his kind of the stuff that's in the archive, but the anti-Semitic material doesn't really appear until sort of later. The anti-Semitic material kind of comes about sort of a bit later, and this is the sort of stuff we start to see that is sort of in the material. And again, I mean, it's just kind of stuff he's kind of collected and things like this. But here we see again the sort of shift. Now this is a slightly later version of Frontal Romanesque sort of propaganda, which is much more explicitly anti-Jewish and anti-Hungarian. It's now actually sort of mentioning them by name, whereas in the first sort of enunciations, it's just foreigners, and sort of maintaining the ethnic proportions and things like this. And here we see, the sort of thing, there's an article here about the fact that, that there's only two, there's 37 synagogues in Chisinau and only 22 churches, and in Hotin there's 23 synagogues and only 4 churches, and so on and so forth, and So these are the sort of things that are sort of generally sort of appearing. You also start to see, the cult of Vida, which they attempted to establish as well. So the thing is, and talking about following the money thing is really, really interesting because Chauvin is dealing with all of the money that Frontal Romanesque have in Mureș County. He's busy distributing it. I have no idea where they're getting that money from. They have money, but it's never quite clear where they're getting the money from. But anyway, the thing with Chauvin is that again. Basically, when Carroll sets up the National Renaissance Front, Chauvin goes with Vida again, and it means promotion again for him. Here he is in all of his National Renaissance Front garb as a founding member. You can't really see it very clearly, but with his kind of swastika armband. The one on the subject of swastikas, one of the things that Frontal Romanesque did produce was they did produce an orthodox calendar. Which featured various prominent members of the party. And the one that I did leap out with was the fact that somebody had a swastika typing, which was kind of there, complete with toothbrush moustache as well. So he was obviously kind of going for it. So the thing with Chauvin is basically he gets promoted again, but again he's more concerned with administration than he is with kind of nationalism and things like this. He's kind of more, And the thing with Shaban in the end, and this is why we have his archive, is that he dies in 1946. He dies shortly before he's due to be arrested by the communists. And as a result, nobody goes and checks his cellar. And so his archive sits in his cellar in Cluj until basically the house gets returned to the family after 1989. They sort of rediscover it. Then it gets a little mysterious. From what I understand, Shaban's son fell out of an apple tree and died, and then his wife gave the archive to the History Museum in Cluj. That kind of seems to be the kind of gist, and that's how it was kind of sat there, and I then sort of read my way through it. So we've got this kind of very good sort of archive of somebody who kind of just was there as an administrator. So just to conclude very, very quickly, okay? I think the thing is that not everybody is a true believer when it comes to anti-Semitism, and not everybody is a pure opportunist when it comes to anti-Semitism. I think by using political science and by actually using some of the frameworks from political science and actually trying to look at the Romanian party system as a party system, one of the things that always frustrates me is when I say about using political science, they go, no, you can't do that with Romania. You can't use, Romanian politics defies political science. Well, let's give it a go, okay? So I think it actually kind of enables us to kind of contextualise and reapproach the way in which actors behave within parties, and the way in which they seemingly shift their positions with ease. How is it that Shaban can go from somebody who's very, very interested in peasant politics and things like this, and go from being in the national movement into the peasant party, from the peasant party into Frontul Românesc, from Frontul Românesc into the National Renaissance Front. I think the thing is that the nature of the party system, the nature of party organisation, and the way in which the structures, particularly these baptismal relations and cadre organisations, created a form of politics that really favoured weak party and ideological loyalty, but very strong personal loyalty. And I think that really, in some ways, this is again a kind of generational thing. But what we're seeing is a lot of these people who are locked into these networks are the older generation. They're the ones who are being threatened by the new mass organisations. But again, for Shaban, the example is it's an illustrative example because he's a very skilled administrator. He's a very intelligent man, but he's essentially kind of blocked off in his career by the nature of the party system, and therefore, really, the only things that are open to him is kind of defection. And that's exactly what he does. When his godfather goes, his protection, he goes with his protection, things like this, and his opportunities and so on and so forth. His commitment is to Vida, his commitment is to his godfather, and so on and so forth, not to any particular party or any particular ideology. Okay, that's it all.